As you may have heard, there are some new drone laws that come into effect from the 1st of January 2021, and that's what we're going to discuss today. Now, the laws come into full effect actually from 2023, but we have a 2-year transitional period, and we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss what these new laws are, how they apply to all drones, and then specifically at the end, we're going to discuss FPV drones because that's the type of drone that I fly, and a lot of people who watch this channel also fly it. But this is true for all drones, so stay tuned either way, and let's just get straight into it. A quick word of warning, it is very complicated. I've read through a document from the CAA which is over 200 pages long. It's called CAP 722, and I'll put a link to that in the description in case you want to read it as well. And if you're wondering why I read through that entire document, I've been revising actually because tomorrow I'm going to be taking an exam called the A2 C of C, and I'll give you some more information about that later on. So let's just get straight into it, and I'm going to kind of break this down into chunks so that hopefully you can understand this. From 2023, all drones sold on the UK market have to be classified with a C, a C0, a C1, a C2, a C3 or a C4. And they're going to classify those drones based on how dangerous they think they are, which is to do with weight and speed and a few other things. So we're going to take a look at what those classes of drone are first so we can understand what a C0 is, what a C1, a C2, a C3 and a C4 is. And then we're going to discuss how that applies transitionally up till then and what these different drones are able to do or not do. So here we go. Class C0, it can be flown in all subcategories, and we're going to get onto what those subcategories are in a moment. It's a very small unmanned aircraft, including toys that are less than 250 grams. They have a maximum speed of 42.5 miles per hour, and they're unable to be flown more than 400 feet above the takeoff point. That's a Class C0. Class C1, it can be flown in all subcategories. Again, we're going to discuss what those subcategories are in a moment. It's less than 900 grams. It's made to perform in a way that if it collides with a human head, the energy transmitted will be less than 80 joules. So that's not really something that a pilot can measure, but the manufacturers are going to have to get that measured and apply it with this C rating. The maximum speed is the same, 42.5 miles per hour, and it's designed to minimize injury to people. There are also some other things, aspects such as noise limits, height limits, geo-awareness and remote identification that have to be applied within this C rating. We're going to get onto the remote identification soon as well, because that I thought was just something that was applied to American law, but it seems like that's coming in the UK as well. We'll come to that in a moment. Class C2 is less than 4 kilograms. It's designed and constructed to minimize injury to people, and it's equipped with a low speed mode, which is a maximum of 6.7 miles an hour. Then we've got C3. It can only be flown far away from people, and we'll get into what that subcategory means in a moment. It's less than 25 kilograms takeoff mass. And then we've got C4. This, again, it won't be able to be flown anywhere near people, property, parks, anywhere like that, which we'll talk about in a second, and it's less than 25 kilograms takeoff mass. Next, we're going to talk about the categories. Let's say you've got a C1 drone. You bought it from 2023 and they've classified it C1. Where can you fly it? That's what we're going to discuss next, because depending on what C you have, depends on where you can fly and how restrictive it is. The least restrictive is C0, the most restrictive is C4. So let's look at what some of those restrictions are and which drones you can fly in which different subcategories. We're all going to be flying within the open category, which means that we don't have to apply for specific permission from the CAA. And within that open category, there are 3 subcategories, A1, A2 and A3. What's true for all of those is that you cannot fly within flight restricted zones, so you can't fly near airports, not within 5 kilometers of them, and there's a good app that will help you to know whether you're in a safe zone to fly or not. I'll put a link to that app in the description, but basically you can't fly near airports. You cannot exceed 400 feet, which is 120 meters in height. And if you want to get an idea of how high that is, if you've ever seen one of the most famous drone flying spots in the UK, which is the abandoned cooling towers, those are 300 feet high. So it's an extra 100 feet on top of that, which I think is pretty high. And certainly with FPV drones, we don't need to exceed that. Usually we're actually quite low down. Anyway, more on that later on. But the other thing is you must maintain visual line of sight. So there's also an exception for that, an exemption for FPV, which we'll discuss at the end. So that's true for all of the subcategories within the open category. You've got to always keep those things in mind. But subcategory A1 is the least restrictive. And if you have a C0 or a C1 drone, you can fly it within the A1 category. You can also fly, because of course none of our drones have been rated C0 or C1 yet, so during the transitional period from now until 2023, if your drone weighs less than 250 grams and if it can't go further than 400 feet from the control link and it's low speed enough, less than 42 miles per hour, then that can be flown in subcategory A1. And you can pretty much fly that in most places. You can fly it in parks, industrial areas. You can fly it over uninvolved people as long as it's not a crowd. It's not very restrictive at all. Unfortunately, a lot of drones don't fall into the A1 category though. A quick note on the A1 category. For a transition period until the 31st of December 2022, some legacy drones with a mass less than 500 grams may also be used in subcategory A1, provided that the remote pilot has successfully completed an additional competency examination, which is the A2 CFC, and that's the examination that I'm going to be doing tomorrow. The A2 CFC allows you to fly in the A2 category as well. That's why it's called the A2 CFC. And let's discuss what that A2 category is right now. It's called fly close to people. In this subcategory, you can fly a C0, C1 or a C2 rated drone. Of course, none of those are out yet. But if you've got the A2 CFC qualification, you can also fly your legacy drone, the one you own already, as long as it's not more than 2 kilograms. I told you it was complicated. And within this A2 category, you can go as close to 30 meters from an uninvolved person, and you can go up to 5 meters away from a completely uninvolved person if you have a low speed mode selected. But you must have that A2 CFC. And that brings us to the final subcategory, A3, which sadly I think a lot of drones are going to fall into. And this is called fly far from people. So within this A3 subcategory, you cannot go within 150 meters of any commercial, industrial, recreational or residential areas. So you can't go within 150 meters of any houses, any car parks, any beaches. Really, it's very restrictive indeed. It only leaves places like out over the open ocean or over some farmland that you have permission to fly over. Possibly abandoned buildings, but then trespass laws apply. That's up to you. And in this A3 subcategory, you can fly C3 or C4 drones. So those will be the sort of ones that they deem heavier, faster, more dangerous. They'll be relegated to this A3 category and they won't be able to be flown anywhere near any people, or like I say, you won't be able to fly them in any of those areas. Let's kind of sum that up. Basically, all drones that are going to be sold on the UK market in 2023 are going to have to be classed C0, C1, C2, C3 or C4. Depending on that classification, depends which subcategory they can be flown in, how restrictive it is and so forth. The open class covers all of us drone flyers, and within that open class you have A1, A2 and A3, and those are the three different sort of restrictions that we must comply by. A couple of quick examples of FPV drones that are out at the moment and how this would apply to them. This is very popular. It's the Beta 95X. It weighs less than 200 grams, and because it's so light and it's not particularly fast, this can be flown within the A1 subcategory. So you can fly this in recreational, industrial and near commercial areas. You can fly it fairly close to uninvolved people. In fact, I believe you can fly this right over an uninvolved person as you're in the A1 category. It's not very restrictive at all, so you get plenty of freedom with a very light, safe drone like this, especially because it has prop guards as well. So this may be the future. Plus this comes ready built, so if people like Beta FPV can apply and get certification to be able to classify this as a C0 or a C1, it would be able to be continued flying in the A1 subcategory from 2023 as well. Then we've got the 5-inch FPV drone. This weighs about 700 grams, and this is typically the most popular drone flown in the FPV hobby. It is pretty fast. It does weigh less than 2 kilograms, but basically at the moment this could only be flown 150 meters away from places like parks, industrial areas, and 150 meters away from people. But if you get the A2 CFC qualification, you could fly this in parks. You could fly it up to 50 meters away from an uninvolved person, and you'll get less restrictions if you do that A2 CFC qualification. The problem we're going to have with these 5-inch FPV drones is this one is custom built, so to be able to do that from 2023 is possibly not going to be a viable thing, because each part would need that rating, and I don't know whether companies will be able to rate a kit or parts with, say, a C0, C1, C2 or whatever. So we may have to buy fully built 5-inch drones that come with that C rating, and we've got to hope that the companies will actually go ahead and get them certified. Otherwise we're going to be stuck with things that are much lighter than this and have to be less than 250 grams, so something more like this. Hopefully it's not the end of building these incredible 5-inch FPV drones. I feel like the skill set and the level that you need to be able to fly one of these really does qualify you to, you know, be able to do it safely and responsibly. So I wish that the CAA were more aware of this hobby and like this kind of skill set that it takes to be able to do this, because we really are highly competent pilots. Now there's something else which I think is pretty concerning, and that is remote identification. So I think a lot of people have missed this, and when I read through the document I saw it, I thought this seems really restrictive. So let's have a look at what this remote ID situation is right now, and then we're going to talk about FPV at the end and see what our exemption is. Remote ID is the ability of a UAS, in other words a drone, to provide identification information that can be received by other parties. The purpose of remote ID is to assist the CAA, law enforcement and security agencies to identify a rogue UA, a rogue drone, or remote pilot or operator who appears to be operating in an unsafe manner or in an area where the UA is not permitted to fly. Remote ID builds on the CAA Drone and Model Aircraft Registration and Education Service, DMARES. Basically, I haven't mentioned this yet, but within all of these subcategories, and if you own any drone at all except for a toy, and to be classed as a toy it has to be labelled on the box that it's a toy, that also has to be less than 250 grams and not have a camera that can capture data. So if you've got a little toy like that, you don't have to register, but everything else you have to at least get you have to register and get an operator ID and a flyer ID, and then you have to put your ID on all of your drones. That's already been the case for the last year, so you probably already know about that. It costs £9 and you can do it. You have to do a test actually. It's on the CAA website. I'll put a link to that in the description if I remember as well. Okay, here's the bit about remote ID that's pretty concerning. Drone operators are required to ensure that each drone is installed with a remote ID system by the 2nd of December 2021. From this date it must be active, i.e. switched on, and up to date whenever the UA is being flown. What that means is we need a device that's capable of transmitting our speed, our height, exactly where we are, how long we've flown for, and all of that information. We need a device that goes on our drone and broadcasts all of that to be available to anybody who might want to police that, or anybody who has the technology to be able to detect that. And what that's going to mean really for FPV is not only are we going to need to get hold of these chips or whatever they are that send out this remote ID, which don't seem to be available yet, but we need them quite soon, by December 2021. It's going to add weight to our craft, and it's going to tell everybody, how fast we're going, which I think is the biggest concern for FPV, because FPV drones are pretty quick. I never exceed the height limit, and I don't fly anywhere dangerous like a flight restricted zone, so it wouldn't concern me in that regard. But it's something we all need to be thinking about, and I think a lot of people have missed this, the fact that it's going to be law to have remote ID on our drones this year. So let's hope that some of the manufacturers produce something that's light and cheap and that we can put in our drones to be lawful. Okay, that's a lot to take in. I know my brain is buzzing with it after the last few days of reading through all this. But finally, what we need to take a look at is the special exemption for FPV. And it's not a huge exemption, but basically the problem with FPV in the eyes of the law is that we're covering our eyes with goggles. And what that means is it's impossible for us to see our craft line of sight. So this law about maintaining VLOS, visual line of sight, is basically impossible for a FPV pilot because our eyes are covered. Having said that, we can see way more than any visual observer or any line of sight observation could tell us, because we're getting real-time information fed straight into the goggles very reliably, which allows us to react very fast and have incredible control over a drone that no other drone pilot can get. But the point is, we've got to be able to follow the law of maintaining visual line of sight. So what they've actually done is they have given us an exemption for small unmanned aircraft first-person view flying. And in a nutshell, what this is, I'll put a link to this in the description as well, but what this is saying is because we can't maintain visual line of sight, we're still allowed to fly, but we must have a spotter next to us, and that person must be able to see the aircraft. So in other words, we can put our goggles on, delegate the line of sight job to a spotter, and they can watch and make sure they maintain visual line of sight. The general concern seems to be, and this is true for most of these regulations, is any interference with aircraft. So they don't want someone putting FPV goggles on and then not being aware that a plane or another flying device came along and then smacking into it. But to be honest, that's kind of irrelevant for FPV, because why would we be up high like that? We tend to fly down low in abandoned buildings, and it's just not, it doesn't really, we're never anywhere near an aircraft. So plus you'd hear it, and you have all this awareness that you're getting from the goggles as well. But, apparently you need to maintain visual line of sight. So to be able to do that, you can give that duty to a spotter. And that's the exemption. So there you go. You've got to fly with a spotter all the time from now on. I'm genuinely really interested to know what you think to all these new laws and regulations. Will you be following them? Will you be doing your exam, the A2 CFC? How heavy is your drone? Is it less than 250 grams? Perhaps that's the future for the hobby. Let me know what you think in the comments. I really am interested, and I'll try and respond to as many as possible. Give us a like, I'd really appreciate that. And if you want to subscribe, you'll see more content like this, also flight videos and tutorials, reviews, you name it. If it's to do with FPV and drones, it'll be on this channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.